Hey everyone, I'm here for the second video of Adam Smith, and so this is the second video to do the first set of readings, right? Next week you're going to do the sort of research on the topic of the company, right, that you've chosen to look at. So we have two chapters still to consider in Adam Smith, and it's very interesting, I think, what he does here, and I think both of the chapters, are super relevant to what you're going to try and do. So he makes a distinction first between subjects that don't engage what he calls the person principally concerned, or you as a spectator watching the person principally concerned. And then cases where you are around other people, but you're sort of looking at objects that don't fundamentally somehow really engage the personal emotions. They, as he puts it at one point, right, they have a more intellectual quality. Now, this is important. In both cases, you still expect a unity or an agreement or a symmetry. That never changes. But it's like what is required in the second case, right, where the emotions, right, rather than the intellectual, but the emotions are really engaged. That's where the heavy lifting of sympathy, the heavy lifting of retaining a unity of emotion really kicks in. So to the first category of objects, right, that don't radically engage the self, right, the persons involved who are engaging with these objects, he gives different things like looking at a beautiful piece of scenery, looking at a picture. Sorry, that's the dogs. But he does say the following thing that I think is very important for your, depending on which of the topics you pick, right? So for those of you who pick, for example, maybe Hermes, this actually will go to this, right? Because you might not agree with, you might actually morally find it sort of repugnant that people spend $12,000, $15,000 on a handbag. Even if that's the case, you ought to be able to intellectually understand why someone might do that. You should be able to intellectually understand why a Hermes handbag is really different than a Michael Kors, right? Because he points out it's not the utility. Both bags do the same. It's not utility. That's not what's at issue. What's at issue is what he calls discernment, refinement, questions of taste. And he says that what this appeals to is the problem of truth. So even though you're totally uninterested maybe in handbags, or you even find them morally abhorrent that people spend that kind of money, you ought to be able to say, okay, I get it. I understand why the Hermes is indeed an object of ambition for some people. In fact, globally, right? For millions of people globally, it's an object of ambition, right? Because you understand the truth of the sophistication of the composition of the item versus something industrially manufactured, right? In the case of the Michael Kors. So he says at one point, right, the agreement about this should come relatively easily. It should even be quite obvious. Now, he does say sometimes to really understand the significance of a painting, of an artwork, you need someone of extreme sophistication in the world of art to be able to kind of really relay to you what the microscopic or the smaller details, the refinements, right? So think about when people go to a foreign city and they hire a tour guide who will guide them through maybe some of the beautiful churches, some of the interesting state buildings, relay a bit of the history, but also relay some of the points of architecture that otherwise somebody just sort of passing through might completely miss, right? So there is a kind of a whole industry connected to this. And of course, people like Hermes are trading upon this. But even in the case, let's say you did the Taylor Swift example, right? Same thing with that, right? So you might not like Taylor Swift, right? But if somebody said, oh, I think she's rubbish, well, that's a bridge too far, right? You'd have to be a Swiftie to be like, well, wait a minute, that can't quite be right, right? There's a problem of truth. It can't quite be right because she wasn't a billionaire when she began, but now she is. So millions of people have transferred their hard-earned property to her by buying tickets for her music, the concerts, the paraphernalia connected with her identity, etc. Right? So when you have something like that happen, it can't be that she's rubbish, right? That you're sort of falsifying things. Now you might not be interested, you might not be emotionally engaged, right? But you still got to say, Smith, step up to the plate of truth, so to say, right? You need to like, wait a minute, yeah, I get it. I get why this might happen, that this person might become a star. Same with the Hermes. Same with the difference between football clubs, that are globally potent as a brand versus, DC United, right? For example, given that we're in Baltimore. All right. But then you've got this so disagreements are possible there, but then you've got this other thing going on, right? Where sympathy is fundamentally engaged, right? This is where somehow what's happening in the world or the objects is really directly personally connected to me. And then we do demand the work of sympathy. We don't just demand an intellectual understanding. Oh, I understand why you feel that way, right? We demand an alliance. We demand some kind of commitment on the part of those who have observed our struggle, joy, trauma, whatever it might be, right? And here's the thing about that, right? That when you place, or when you make the demand of sympathy, when you want people's emotions to literally reach out and kind of fuse with your own, you come across a kind of, he doesn't quite put it this way, but it's a kind of a metaphysical problem. Namely, that persons are very different from one another. And this is why he says, and this is very relevant to the exegesis that I want you to do, right? Notice he says this, that when the spectator unifies or syncs the spectator's emotions with yours, then that is what he calls an analogous relationship, or he says at one point later on in the passage, a reflected passion, or he says there is a secret consciousness that always persists, that however much I'm modeling and syncing my emotions with yours, I'm not really the one undergoing that emotion. I'm not really the one that needs that emotional connection. Right? That's the person principally concerned, that really wants that sympathetic connection. Now, this places a moral requirement upon both parties. In the case of the spectator, the moral requirement is to exhibit what he calls the amiable virtue. The idea that you are always open to engaging with others emotionally. You don't want to be cold and distant and austere, right? So there is a moral requirement upon us that we be open to being spectators. But on the part of the person principally concerned, there's a different kind of moral requirement, and that is what he calls to exhibit the respectable virtues. The example he gives, and this might even be in the exegesis, right? He says people don't like, so in other words, right, the spectator recoils from, and therefore negatively judges, recoils from those who exhibit clamorous grief, right? Where someone's grief, it's like they're pushing it away from themselves, literally onto you and into you, right? So it's clamorous, right? It's sort of sticking to you, right? And so you feel a resistance to that, right? I mean, because people don't want to be unhappy, right? So you feel a resistance to that. They demand too much, right? Because there's always this sort of metaphysical divide, right? That each of us as a person has a certain kind of independence of being, and in order to bridge that, as he points out, right, that's the difference between the intellectual and the sympathetic. That's work. That's an effort. And so you need moral virtues, moral attitudes to navigate that work. So on the one hand, right, you don't want to refuse that work. But on the other hand, you can't overly expect it of others, right? And so the thing is, right, these two categories of moral attitudes or virtues, both, we are all of us expected to have both capacities, right? To be open to others, right? But also to be somewhat guarded and hesitant about how much we expect of others, right? So the amiable and the respectable, you've got to have both. But in certain circumstances, right, only one or the other might be prominent, right? So if I'm suffering from grief, then what is sort of placed upon me is the burden, even amidst the grief, the burden of showing the respectable virtue, where I hold a certain kind of composure and I allow that emotion to be displayed, right? Because I want your connection, I want your union with me, right? Emotionally, right? But I can't overly display it. I can't exaggeratedly display it, because then it's clamorous. And that oversteps the boundary, that oversteps the mark. It's too presumptuous. And this is because, right, it's part of human dignity, right, that we, all of us, are these sort of independent, somewhat autonomous, self-directed beings, right? So maybe a way to think about this, if you've ever had a friend who you have felt has sort of consistently demanded too much from you, then you're understanding Adam Smith, right? But what's the fault of your friend? They have not exhibited sufficiently the respectable virtues. They have demanded too much that you show the amiable virtue. And I think that's probably a pretty common experience. I suppose grimly, you might be like, wait a minute, that's kind of me. Like, I am a kind of a, high intensity friend to have, right? I do rather expect a great deal from others, right? So I suppose then what Smith would say, well, you might want to think about reforming yourself and doing some moral work to build the right proportion between these two virtues. Okay, all right. So that's the 2 videos I've done so far brings to a close the readings for this week. Okay, so good luck with those. Good luck with the exegesis, and I look forward to reading your work. Okay, bye-bye.